Welcome back to Dialogue on Public Issues. I'm John Chowney with Campbellsville University. On Tuesday, November 6th, voters across the country and here in Kentucky will be going to the polls to elect a number of officials. Here in Campbellsville, Taylor County, and throughout Kentucky, we'll be electing local officials, state legislators, and some congressional races. Nationally, quite a bit at stake with the so-called midterm elections and control of the Senate and the House in Washington up for grabs. And today I'm very pleased to be hosting Dr. Josiah Marineau and Dr. Shawn Williams, both professors of political science here at Campbellsville, both very knowledgeable individuals, and I'm very pleased to have them here today as resource persons to talk about the election. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, sir.
This is Dr. Marineau and Dr. Williams. I'm sure they'll be identified. Tell me just a little bit about yourselves, where you come from and how you got to Campbellsville, and then we'll delve into the subject of the day.
So I'm Shawn Williams. I've been here, I'm finishing on my 8th year at Campbellsville University, teaching in the political science program. Originally from Texas, but moved around a little bit to a couple of other states, so not entirely, I suppose, rooted in the Texas traditions. But
I'm in my third year, blessed to be in my third year here at Campbellsville. I also came here by way of Texas, but I'm originally from Alaska, so I was born and raised in Alaska, and now blessed to be here in central Kentucky.
Very good. So there's some kind of Texas connection here in terms of our political science. I'll have to study that and then divulge it later on.
If you want to understand the future of Kentucky politics, you just need to
go to Texas.
Look what's happening in
There's
Texas.
probably some truth in that. Now, in the election cycle, of course, as I noted at the very beginning, we have local elections here in Kentucky, state elections as far as legislative races, and then the national election cycle. Let's just start locally. Dr. Williams, what are some of the offices on the ballot here in Taylor County, and it would be across Kentucky?
Sure. Yeah, essentially all of the county races are open. We also have on the ballot both our state legislative representatives, the House representatives, and the Senate, both of those offices on the ballot. And of course, the U.S. 1st Congressional District, U.S. Kentucky 1st District is on the ballot as well. Some of those races are more competitive than others, but we're certainly paying attention to all of them.
Dr. Marineau, anything to add on that as far as here in Kentucky or locally?
Locally, to build on what was just said, of course we have the mayoral race, 2 candidates for that. City Council is also up for election.
12 will win, to top 12 vote getters, I believe.
Is it 11 or 12?
And there's like 21 candidates. Yeah, so that will be interesting to watch that.
Exactly.
And then what else?
The Judge County Executive as well is up for election.
And the legislative body, what we call in Kentucky fiscal court members, or
the magistrates.
Some might call county commission, but in Kentucky we still use those old judicial terms from the days when they had both legislative and actually they had all three. They had executive, judicial, and to legislative function in the old days. Our primary point of discussion today is going to focus on the national elections, that is the congressional races. Here in Kentucky, Dr. Marineau, are there any races of particular interest in the congressional realm?
Well, of course, the U.S. representative for this area, Representative Jamie Comer, is running for re-election. He has an opponent who is a professor of English out of Murray State, a man named Paul Walker. So that will be one race to watch because that'll be relevant for people here. Any other national races, I don't feel like there are as many competitive races in this state as maybe compared to some other states.
I know that a lot of people are looking at the 6th Congressional District, which is, of course, Andy Barr is the current incumbent. He's being faced with a surprisingly resilient challenger, Amy McGrath, who defeated in the Democratic primary a couple of traditional Kentucky politicians and appears to have at least a shot at taking that seat, which would give Kentucky 2 Democratic representatives instead of 1. We're still seeing how that race shakes out, though. It's been kind of back and forth, but right now most of the polls show it at least within the margin of error. So that is kind of a toss-up in those categories.
That's kind of a bellwether, wouldn't you say? That particular race for the national, not Kentucky as much as the national situation.
There are a lot of pundits who are arguing that the forces nationally can be captured with what's happening in that district. It's a district that went for Donald Trump, and yet the registrations favor the Democratic Party.
Right.
You have an incumbent who most people thought was going to be okay until the water started moving out on the Trump tide. Amy McGrath is one of a number of female candidates, a growing number of veteran candidates who've fought in the Iraq or Afghanistan wars and have come back to run for public office now. So a lot of those factors that people see nationally are kind of at play in that race.
And Ms. McGrath, you'll recall, announced her candidacy a little over a year ago. And at that point, Mayor Gray of Lexington was considered a strong favorite to win the Democratic primary. And then her coming out, her announcement received national attention. And of course, she has a military record and attained the rank of colonel, I believe, or lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and has a very compelling record. So that race is going to be interesting, as you say.
Yeah, it'll be for us who study politics. It's going to be a fun one to watch.
Yeah.
If Amy McGrath can win the 6th congressional district, it's going to indicate that the Democratic Party has a realistic chance of taking the House of Representatives, which is something, honestly, 4 years ago I wouldn't have thought would really been possible, just because of the state level advantages that Republicans have enjoyed across the country. If, however, she loses and loses by a wide margin, we'll see that in the Eastern time zone, and we can use that to extrapolate forward that the Republicans are probably going to have a pretty good night.
Kentucky is still, we're a red state according to voting trends, and the registration has tightened. But I can remember the day 20 plus years ago when the registration was about 2.5 to 1. Now it's narrowed, but we're still a Democratic state by several hundred thousand as registered voters. So that's part of what the McGrath campaign's depending on. Other comments on that particular race or any races here in Kentucky?
Just the polls have tightened. The last poll I saw for the McGrath Barr race was, I think Barr was up by 1 percentage point in that particular poll, which of course is well within the margin of error. So a very close race.
Yeah. Speaking of the Trump impact here in Kentucky, it's interesting to note that I was told by someone who has access to some of the polling data from at the national level that President Trump is more popular in the 1st congressional district than most any other congressional district in America. I don't know that. I don't have that data here to put out on the table. But as a whole, and of course, as you said, that's the district we live in. It's a very conservative area, although it was known as the Rock of Gibraltar of the Democratic Party until about 20 years ago.
I think when you look at the behavior of James Comer, since he has won the office of House of Representatives a couple of years ago, and also in his current election, he is certainly taking great care to stay on Trump's side on most issues. Even when he was a statewide official, he was a little bit more moderate. He has certainly moved to the right, which suggests that at least his campaign thinks that if you can win the Trump voter, you can win the district.
The one issue in Kentucky that I sense is moving some of that Trump vote away is the trade issue. You want to comment on that in terms of the impact it has on a state like Kentucky?
Well, the Trump administration has the belief that the U.S. has lost a lot of jobs, a lot of economic potential as a result of international free trade deals, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, among others. And so what they've done is tried to attach tariffs to imports from various countries like China, but also from friendly countries like Canada and even, I think, Mexico. They've threatened tariffs as a way to try to renegotiate trade deals. But these countries have reciprocated, and that's why we're calling this a trade war, is we're seeing reciprocated tariffs. These countries are very knowledgeable about the kinds of areas of the country that have supported Trump. So they put tariffs on things such as on bourbon and other kinds of exports from the United States that are going to hurt just those constituencies that tended to support Trump. So you might see some real negative impacts in just those areas where people were expecting Trump to have more of a positive economic impact.
And the same thing is true in terms of how Trump is fighting the trade war. If you listen to his rhetoric, it mostly focuses on what's good for the automotive industry. And if you look at his electoral map that he won because he won states like Michigan, because he did better in northern Illinois than you would expect. He did well in Wisconsin and Minnesota, areas that are part of the traditional big three automotive supply chain. So it's as though he is saying, I'm going to double down to support the economies of these swing states that I need to win, maybe at the expense of some of the districts that I know that I'm going to win in, thinking that that'll work out to his advantage. But as Dr. Marineau said, for House members who are running in some of these districts, there's probably going to be some casualties from the trade war.
Certainly the trade war has an impact here in Kentucky. Just as Dr. Marineau just alluded, the bourbon industry, Kentucky is known as a primary bourbon exporter worldwide, globally. It's a big growing importance in Kentucky, part of the history and tradition. I'm Baptist minister. I don't imbibe, please understand, but we must acknowledge its importance to Kentucky. The farm industry, the agricultural industry, which is already, a few years ago it was booming with the grain prices and so forth. The grain prices have come down, commodities have come down. One of the things that China did was, as you alluded, they did their analytics, and they slapped a tariff on soybeans.
Right.
And that is having an effect in the agricultural community. Now, how much that will affect probably won't have a major effect in Kentucky in this election, but certainly in some of the other states in the Midwest that you alluded to, the Rust Belt, it could affect them. And there's beginning to be more concern. I mean, I've heard some, even Kentucky congressional representatives make the comment that we're going to give President Trump until the first of the year.
Right.
And see how this works out. Then if things are still, if it's not just a strategy, negotiating strategy, but rather it's a end policy goal, then we're going to have to do some things to back him off.
There are two important factors, and this is going to be true for the current election cycle. This is going to be a factor in the 19 race. It's going to be a factor in the 20 race. When you look at the growth data, the economic growth forecasts in Kentucky and elsewhere, urban areas are showing significant signs of economic growth. They've fully recovered from the recession of 2008. Our urban areas, Louisville and Lexington, they're doing quite well. None of that growth is trickling into the areas of the state that are hardcore Trump supporters, the rural parts of the state. However, when you look at who's purchasing the imports at places like Walmart's and the Dollar Generals and the Family Dollars, the areas where the price increases are going to be felt the soonest, those are also predominantly in rural areas. So people in those Trump zones aren't going to see the economic benefits, but they're going to start to feel the price increases. They're going to see the job losses, and that's going to make the 2019 race and the 20 race particularly interesting.
That's particularly, don't you think, both gentlemen, in areas like Appalachia, in West Virginia, which was the biggest margin of any state, I believe, for Trump. Kentucky wasn't that far behind, but if the coal industry doesn't, the president has promised to bring back the coal industry, very emphatic. If that coal industry doesn't have some rebound, don't you think that will affect as well? His performance in areas like that.
And if the steel industry doesn't come back, Pennsylvania is going to flip back to the blue category, and the Trump momentum might be lost in 2020.
Sure. Here in Kentucky, and I know we jumped to the national, here in Kentucky, it's generally considered that Republicans will retain legislative control, both the House and the Senate. The House theoretically could be in play, but right now it doesn't seem to be. What is the primary issue, though, overall in those state legislative races, Dr. Marineau, would you think?
What's the main issue overall in the state races? I think it's probably reflecting just trends that have been going on for a long time in Kentucky. So you mentioned over the past 20 years, even though there are a plurality of voters that are Democratic, Democrats in Kentucky nowadays are actually, their actual policy preferences are more reflective of the Republican Party than the National Democratic Party, by and large. So I think as you have that stronger kind of Republican leaning, I think we're just going to see that continue with a continued hold of the House by the Republicans. That's my sense.
Dr. Williams?
Yeah, family values. The opioid epidemic is obviously going to be an issue that's on everybody's agenda. But so far, the Republicans have done a pretty good job of staying in front of that issue, at least politically, and have shown a willingness to work through that issue, which is, again, one of the reasons why it looks like the House and the Senate should both stay with the Republican Party.
Nationally, what are the primary issues? We've talked, we've kind of covered that, but let's zero in on it a little more. Obviously, we have said the trade issue, protectionism versus free trade is an issue. What other issues, Dr. Marineau, would you see in play impacting this election outcome? Excuse me.
The biggest factor is that this is a midterm election for a president whose approval ratings are in the low 40%. I looked at it this morning, I think it was 40.3. His disapproval rating is around 52. So it's very high disapproval rating for a second year in. Midterm elections typically benefit the party that's out of power. Right. So the Democrats would already be positioned to do pretty well, but when you have the president's low approval rating, and then several of the cultural issues that we're seeing play out right now, such as the Me Too movement, debates over immigration, debates over ethnicity and racial issues, those things are, when they're the topic of the conversation, that's not going to typically benefit the Republicans. Those aren't areas where they tend to excel at in the same way the Democratic Party tends to be more comfortable having those conversations. So I think there are several things that are going kind of against the Republicans right now, and we're likely to see that in terms of the outcomes in November.
Dr. Williams.
And what isn't an issue is the economy, which is interesting because typically we place in the United States economic matters are kind of at the top of the list. But we've experienced now since the recession, certainly since 2010, we've had these 8 years of continuous economic growth. The economy is doing really well, but it was doing really well a couple of years ago. The verdict's out on how much of an impact Trump's policies have had. Conservatives obviously think it has. Democrats don't necessarily believe that. But as strong as the economy is, you would assume that the governing party would be able to pick up an economic benefit, and polls just aren't reflecting that.
Not picked up yet. It doesn't appear.
No, not at all.
And of course, the Republican Congress and the White House staked a lot on the tax cuts, so-called tax reform and tax cuts, and that doesn't seem to be empowering the grassroots organization that's needed. And as Dr. Marineau said, historically, you always, or much of the time, the party controlling the White House loses votes, loses seats in the first and second midterm cycles if they are elected to a second term. So history is on the side of the Democrats here,
at least in the House.
And the House, I think, what is it, 23 seats that are needed to pick up. So you look at a national framework, and that's not an impossible thing to achieve. What's your best guess at this point in time?
Best guess, if you look at where the polls are, most people have the Democrats sitting around 204 to 208. A couple have them at 210 that are pretty solidly in the Democratic category. There are about 40 seats that are considered to be legitimately leaning. Of those 40, 38 are currently held by the Republican Party, only 2 are Democrat. It looks as if the Democratic Party is going to probably get 20 to 25 of that batch and will end with a narrow control of 30 or 40 seats by the time you do all the math. End up with a narrow control of the House of Representatives, picking up maybe a total of about 40 seats when they need about 20, 25. But we're 6 weeks out, and there's still plenty of time for any of the number of factors that are in play right now to kind of shift that dial.
What are the kinds of issues that could change these dynamics? The kinds of things that might hit, that we always in presidential politics talk about an October surprise. There could be an October surprise in legislative or congressional races as well. Any thoughts on that?
Well, and hopefully, of course, heaven forbid something like this happen. If there was some kind of major terror attack, that could change the dynamics. Something having to do with national security, an international war breaking out, something in the Middle East, there's always a potential for that, something with North Korea or South Korea, if that were to flare up somehow. I think national security issues would change the dynamic, but I think it would take quite a bit at this point to change the trajectory.
Yeah, that would seem to be the case. We think back to the 2008 election where Obama appeared to have the headwind, McCain was kind of gaining on him, and then the bottom fell out of the economy. But even in that situation, it took a couple of months. The economic crisis started in about June. It still took a couple of months for the voters to really register a shift in opinion. With only 6 weeks left, the stock market could crash tomorrow, and voters probably wouldn't factor that into the equation in time for it to change the outcome of the race.
If the Democrats win the House, and that's the best prognostication, although Larry Sabato said today in his weekly column there was I think he put a slight possibility in certain scenarios, and one of them was Andy Barr winning and some other races like that where Republican incumbents are being challenged, and whether Republicans could, there are several seats held by Republicans where Hillary Clinton actually carried the congressional district, and the Democrats are really obviously targeting those. But assuming the current trend stays on course and Republicans and Democrats win the House, who will be the Speaker?
Well, if the Democrats win, that's probably only going to help Pelosi, because she can claim to be the minority leader who oversaw the retaking of the House. There's no clear alternative frontrunner to Pelosi right now. There are some people waiting in the wings. Steny Hoyer, the minority whip, is one of these individuals. There are a few African-American congressmen and congresswomen that are also interested in eventually stepping up. One name that I've read would be Hakeem Jeffries out of New York. He's a 48-year-old congressman, third term. So, but he might also be willing to wait, because Nancy Pelosi is, I think, in her late 70s. She, of course, will retire at some point. So he might be willing to wait it out and be her replacement rather than challenging her up front.
Yeah. I would think that's true. It's not like you had in the Senate where you had a Chuck Schumer who was the obvious heir apparent to the throne whenever Harry Reid stepped aside. In the House, the Democratic Party in general has a leadership problem where there aren't very many really obviously great Democratic senators or candidates to step up to the prime. And so I can't imagine that somebody could really threaten Nancy Pelosi. Now, if the Democrats lose the House, I think she will no longer be the minority leader. I think that much should be obvious.
Agreed.
Will we hear increasingly from the Republicans that a vote for whomever is a vote to bring Nancy Pelosi back? I mean, Republicans have done a pretty good job of running against Nancy. I mean, Republicans hope she stays around, I'm sure. And as far as that goes, I'm sure Democrats hope, I'm sure they would have liked Newt Gingrich to stay on in perpetuity. But there are some reform candidates on the Democratic side that have said they would not vote for her to be Speaker. So it'll be interesting if they win how much of that coalesces and how they handle, they could just abstain and not vote.
What could conceivably happen is if the Democratic Party has an overwhelming success, and if they end up with 260, 270, you end up with the same situation that you had when Newt Gingrich became Speaker the first time. There are so many freshman Democrats who are coming in that the traditional Democratic power base becomes upset or disestablished. That could conceivably happen. But absent some kind of a landslide, I think the current Republican leadership will maintain the day. The current Democratic leadership will maintain the day.
The Senate conventional wisdom has been during the summer into the early fall, maybe Labor Day or so, that Republicans probably would retain control by 1 or 2 seats. However, the polling has changed. It appears. What's going on there, do you think? I think most people now are saying the Republicans might have a slight edge in retaining control, but it's fluid right now.
The polls I've seen are basically what you're suggesting. Republicans have a slight edge. They are expected to either have a single seat majority or a 50-seat tie, which of course the Republicans can break that tie because of the vice president. One of the concerns for the Democrats is, kind of almost paradoxically, they're expected to win the House, but they're actually underperforming, at least on some polls, in some states that went for Trump. So senators like Claire McCaskill out of Missouri is surprisingly threatened in terms of where she's standing at the polls. There's a senator in Florida, North Dakota, who are sort of underperforming. And so the thing for Republicans is they're defending fewer seats.
Right.
Republicans or Democrats are defending 27, Republicans are only defending 8. So they just have a more advantageous landscape.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly it. There are 9 sort of swing Senate seats that could conceivably go either way. The Democrats are defending 5 of those 9. And as Dr. Marineau mentioned, 3 of those are in Republican territory. So even if they could pick up the 4 seats that are currently being held by Republicans, which would require them to take states like Texas and Tennessee, they still have to hold serve. And that's difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult to see them winning in an Arizona or a Texas.
Okay. Obviously in Kentucky, there's interest in that because we don't have a Senate race, but the question becomes whether Senator McConnell retains the majority leader's position or not. So it's a direct import to Kentucky. Moving quickly, we're down to just a couple of minutes. In 2019, we have statewide constitutional races. The big question is, can Governor Matt Bevin be reelected? He is running. There had been some question about that. He is running. Some speculation he may have a primary opponent of some, at least a respectable opponent. Democrats, anybody and everybody running. Attorney General Beshear already running. What's your feeling about that race?
On the Democratic side, or the
the whole thing, quickly.
Well, quickly, I think it's sort of like what we're seeing at the national level with the presidency. The Democrats are seeing a vulnerability, and so a lot of people are testing the waters. Of course, Attorney General Beshear has visited Campbellsville many times. Secretary of State Allison Lundergan Grimes also is expressing or kind of sensing an interest in running as well. So we'll see.
She's encountered some issues.
She has.
Since her Fancy Farm speech, which was probably the best speech of the day.
Agreed.
And she's having some pretty serious issues in terms of things. Other candidates you think
her
will
and her family.
Her father too.
Yeah, her father.
Exactly.
Yeah, honestly, I think that Matt Bevin is the same situation McConnell was when he ran for re-election. People in Kentucky don't like him, but they don't like the other guy even more. And in a state like Kentucky, the Democrats have to put up a viable contender. I'm not sure that Beshear is the person for the job.
Other candidates were likely on the Democrat side are Rocky Adkins, state minority leader, and also possibly Adam Edlin, former state auditor, both of whom have been here many times. I think we're out of time, gentlemen. Thank you so much. We'll probably have a post-election interview. And then as 2019 comes, we're going to have all kinds of things to talk about. And then there's 2020. Will Donald Trump run again? Who will be the Democratic nominee? This is John Chowning. We encourage all of you to go vote for the candidates of your choice on Tuesday, November 6th. Thank you.